everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan, and on this episode of Wandering DMs, we're going to be talking about what is the best single die for the core Dungeons & Dragons mechanic. Should it be the D4 or the D6, the D8? Those are your main contenders, or maybe something else. And how did that change over the years? Because it's actually evolved in kind of surprising way. Big thanks to our viewer, Dan Ebert, for the idea today. We'll talk about that and a whole lot more today on Wandering DMs.
Before we get into that, I will just remind everyone that, as always, at the end of the show, we will have our after-party chat. That is a private video chat on our Discord server available to all our patrons. You can join in on that by becoming a patron. Visit us at wanderingdms.com/Patreon. Sorry, got that backwards. Visit patreon.com/wanderingdms. Join at any tier, and you'll get access to the Discord server and our after-party chats.
We enjoy chatting with our viewers so much, and the fact we get to do it on Discord is a really bright part of our day. And already we have some really interesting comments happening in the live chat right now already on this topic that we're kind of sprung on people to a little bit. Again, thanks to Dan Ebert, who brought up this idea a little bit in the past. We actually have had a recent conversation on our Discord server as far as like how we run original D&D games. And there's actually a question that pops up quite a bit is the basic die for hit dice and classes and damage from weapons. Do you use a D6 or a D8? Because some people do either way, and while both sides say that we're playing original D&D. Now, I will say that Josh has already sprung in the chat and said, split the difference and use a D7, use a 7-sided die. And thanks so much. Thanks so much for that great suggestion. I will point out that I resisted the D7 for a long time, and our friend Max tried to find reasons to force it upon me, and I finally found a good use for it. Have I said this before, Paul? What the actual good use of it? For the 7-sided die? No, what's the actual good use? I finally found there's a real-world metric, a real-world scale for real-world measurements that is 7 steps deep, and it's called the Bristol Stool Scale, for measuring how firm your poop is. So if you want to roll a real-world random poop consistency, grab a 7-sided die, and that's exactly what you should do. And so from having discovered that, I call it the poop die. I actually call it something else, but I can't say that here.
I think you can. I think you'd be within your quota. But, I mean,
Paul, it's Mother's Day. You're reminded that it's Mother's Day, and this is what we're talking about. So I'm not going to say that today for all the mothers that are watching today. And thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Happy Mother's Day, everyone. I guess from like a parity perspective, if you really are looking for like the middle, there's an argument there for the D8, right? Because you have 2 dice steps lower, you have the D6 and the D4, and you have 2 dice steps higher, the D10 and the D12.
Oh,
you're right in the middle of the spectrum of number of sides of dice before it then starts to jump, right? And you get up into your 20s and your 30s, etc.
Well,
unless like DCC, you dive into those weird like D14s and D16s, and those are the dice that I really like. Really, you need a D16? These arguments all have some strong points, and you know what? Even with DCC, even though I don't like the non-polyhedral, the non-platonic dice, like when we people of our age first came to D&D and discovered these, what were these exotic, unusual dice at some point, and that was part of the exotic attraction to the game. I can see, Goodman coming in with DCC and saying, I want to get that feeling back, and here's a whole bunch of dice that you've never seen before in your life, and it's a core part of this game, and feel that novelty again. Of course, that puts you on a track of having to invent dice forever. Yeah, these days, in the modern day, where, maybe a little more used to, in larger society, seeing polyhedral dice out and about. Just yesterday, my town had a steampunk festival in its central square.
Oh, really?
Yep. So there's a whole bunch of vendors out there, and sure enough, there was a booth that was selling polyhedral dice, like you do at your steampunk festival in your town. Yeah, yeah, it's a little right. So, but like, it just is a little more mainstream, and you have to remember that, like back in the '80s or even late '70s, when these games were coming out, that polyhedral dice were very rare. Right? They were. I mean, they were so difficult to come by that, Dan, that your basic set of D&D didn't even come with them. Right? Just had cardboard chits.
Mm-hmm.
And you have things like, they're used kind of being sort of optional in OD&D. And I was reminded again, another point on this is, I was recently saw a news article about Tunnels and Trolls, because I guess Flying Buffalo recently got acquired by another company. And it was pointing out how one of the thrusts of Tunnels and Trolls was to be a little more accessible to the general public. And I've heard this story many times about how Ken St. Andre wrote Tunnels and Trolls because he got a copy of OD&D and couldn't really make heads or tails of it and wanted something easier to grok for the general gamer. It uses only D6s. Like, intentionally only D6, because that's what gamers generally had, right? You probably had a, Monopoly and Risk and maybe some others kicking around on your shelf. I had a moment there where I confused Risk and Clue in my head, and that got really weird. It's a very different game when you're trying to take over the ballroom. Anyway,
there's a matchup.
Yeah,
it's kind of like chess boxing. You just switch back and forth, right? Is it in palace intrigue and then geopolitical conflict.
There you go. Anyway, yeah. So it's it's interesting. It's, to keep that in mind. I guess keep that in mind as we talk about the history of it. That like the polyhedral dice were very strange and unusual when these games came out.
Yes, let me throw up a comment from Lore Pseudo here. So Lore Pseudo in the chat is saying that those chits who, like me, got the basic D&D set with no dice and just chits, and saying those chits set me back a year in learning D&D. And I totally sympathize with it. I think original D&D had the original basic set was intended, and we're talking 1980, I believe, 1979, had dice that came with it, and they quickly sold out. TSR sold out of it, couldn't supply dice anymore, and therefore had about a year where they were selling basic sets as cardboard chits. And Lore Pseudo and myself got in that window. I absolutely was playing D&D as the DM, shaking little cups and pulling out chits for randomization for a whole year, and it was time consuming. It spent quite a bit of time. And one of the brightest memories in my entire life wasn't a birthday, wasn't Christmas. My mom just took pity on me without telling me at all. Went to a store, grabbed bought some polyhedral dice, and just walked in on a random day and said, "Hey, here." And I was like, "Oh my god." Oh my God! It just like the chits are gone. It was just like these things actually exist, right? For a whole year, it had been like this mythical, it's a story that I wasn't entirely even sure was a thing, and to actually have them physically in my hand as solids was a game changer, literally.
Fascinating. So of course, my first set was the Mulve. So certainly remember having the dice and the crayon. But nonetheless, still, you had maybe one set of those dice at the table for the entire group of players. You had one set, right? And I definitely remember times of playing where like there were just too many of us, or maybe we lost some of the dice or whatever. And I certainly remember making my own chits, right? Like taking just loose leaf paper and writing numbers on it, putting it in a hat. Because, there you go. That was I remember doing that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Because I never had to do that. So one of the questions, so the first thing you brought up, Paul, was just acquisition of. I think we can all agree that the 6-sided dice were certainly more common. I think if you look in the history of it, ancient cultures did have actually some non-D6 sided dice. Like I think that we have evidence of Egyptians having 4-sided dice and Romans using 20-sided dice. As a matter of fact, we have a number of cases of that. But certainly in popular culture, the cubic ones they're easiest to store. They're used for most games like that. So
And I apologize. This is one of these days where I think it's really interesting to look at the original texts and see what's in there. So if you look at original D&D, 1974, and Paul, I'm looking at the text that has a yellow highlight kind of up on the page.
Let's see if I can find that for you. This one, recommended equipment.
So this is, I think, page 2 of the very first volume of original D&D in 1974. You got this recommended equipment list, which I go back to over and over again because I think there's so many interesting things here. Like, you need Dungeons and Dragons. First of all, you need a copy of Avalon Hill's Outdoor Survival, right? About the fourth thing down is you obviously need a copy of the Chainmail game, which is why I go back to it on practically a daily basis. But the thing, yeah, you need some dice. So the third thing there is you need some dice. The following different kinds of dice are available as a separate product from TSR. And it says you should have one pair of 4-siders, one pair of 8-siders, a pair of 20-siders, a pair of 12-siders, and then what I have highlighted there, 4 to 20 pairs of 6-sided dice. So on the somewhere between 8 and 40 6-sided dice you're expected to have here. So
well, that's to serve your up to 50 players, I assume.
Correct. Which it says further up on the page there, between I don't know 10 and 50 players for your campaign or something like that. So clearly, the initial instinct there is that you're going to have lots of 6-siders. You're going to have lots of 6-sided dice. You're gamers, presumably. You already have that. That'll be easy. And so a lot of our game, without even saying it, is just going to assume that the 6-sided die is the basic default die. And what we'll see in a lot of original D&D, they don't even bother to tell you what type of die to roll. They'll say, roll a die, roll 2 dice. They don't even say what type. And most of us all interpret that as they must be talking about 6-sided dice because that's the default. Presumably, partly because of this acquisition thing. And look, if you play, my Book of War game, right? Paul was talking about Tunnels and Trolls, which was designed to all be D6s. My Book of War game that we play Thursday nights on the channel is also designed to all be a 6-sided dice for convenience. And if you play classic Warhammer, that's the same kind of thing. And you can easily go into a store and buy, big bricks of dozens of 6-sided dice. That's very easy. I don't know where I can go and buy like a batch of 40 8-sided dice. That becomes a little bit harder to find. Now, Paul, I'm not hearing you right at the moment. Is that my end or your end? Is that okay? Let me switch my earbuds here. Maybe it's my end.
Can you hear me now? Are you there, Dan?
Can the viewers hear Paul?
Yeah.
Josh says
like yes.
Paul's muted.
Sounds like they can hear me. Sounds like they can hear me, Dan. Are you not hearing me? This is sorry, everyone. Stand by due to technical difficulties as Dan tries to figure out.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for debugging that, guys.
Yeah. Great. Interesting. Okay. Don't know what happened there. Where were we? Dice. Right. So, I was saying that you certainly they don't package D8s like that, right? You don't get D8s in a box, but most vendors sell them individually. And if you went to one and were just like, I want 10 D8s, you could probably get them.
True. At the time, right? For those of us that were fighting with chits, and it was difficult to even get a single D8, a single 8-sided die. It was out of the question. But anyway, so the very first publication assumed D6s, and you can see in a bunch of places like I think I probably have maybe 3 things here. Like if you look at the class chart, like the fighter class chart. So there's a table with like a table up top and some text at the bottom. Yeah. So, for example, here's the fighter class table as it shows up in the first volume of D&D for fighters,
and you can see use the names for the different levels at the time. It says dice for accumulated hits. Now, it doesn't say what type of die to use, right? And you can see that it's, for the levels 2, 3, 4, you've got 2 dice or 3 dice or 4 dice. And then when it says 5 plus 1, you're rolling, the interpretation is you're rolling 5 dice and just adding 1 more point to it, is what it is. It never says what type of die to roll. They have an example further down that says, here's dice for your accumulated hits, right? And it says, okay, a superhero, which is 8th level, is going to get 8 dice plus 2. And for example, they rolled and they scored 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you add that up and add another 2, and now you have your hit points. So literally never tells you what die to roll. Presumably it must be 6-sided dice. It's the only type of which you're supposed to have at least 8 of them or more. And obviously the example there, the highest thing they roll in the example is 6. That's kind of bolsters that interpretation. But all the classes are like this. Fighters, and wizards, clerics, they're all rolling the same kind of dice. They're all rolling d6s at this point.
Right. No, but I mean, remind me, I think the only case in OD&D where you're rolling anything other than a d6 is the alternate combat system, right? Isn't it presented as an option?
In the first supplement, yes. In the next supplement that shows up a year later, that's the first place they start talking about using different dice for hits and damage. Yes.
Right.
So there's an interesting detail here because I have the original D&D page labeled alternate combat system, and so this has I don't know if you can actually see at the top where it says alternate combat system. And you get the hit table.
No, sorry, viewers. One of the things you have to deal with here is, as Dan has cut out images for us to share with you that are just tiny blocks of text. No, they're tiny. In my preview, they are illegible tiny blocks of text. You cannot tell one from the other. So here we go. We're just going to guess. We're just going to guess.
That's it, Paul. So simple.
Right on them.
So easy.
The system was clearly meant for showing images and not blocks. There you go. Anyway,
there you go.
Okay.
There you go. Totally my bad. That's on me. So here in original D&D, there's this weird thing that's really hard to remember. Actually, is that in the table we just saw, the fighter class, its combat ability is actually referring back to chainmail, which is an all D6 system. So go back to chainmail and look at where it says how many men, and basically. So anyway, look back to chainmail. And then a couple pages later, they have this weird thing you might consider trying, what's officially labeled as the alternative combat system, in which you might consider using a 20-sided die for your attacks. And if you want to try out this novel, interesting experiment that we're considering, then look at this matrix, take your fighter level, for the column, take the armor class for the row, and this will show you what you need to roll on 20-sided die. So technically, that's the alternative combat system, is this idea of using a 20-sided die. At the very bottom, it says, right after you check for your attack, or the very last line here, is it says, all attacks which score hits do 1 to 6 points of damage unless otherwise noted. And so here's the really interesting thing. That wasn't there in the first printing. The first printing of D&D never said what to do if you hit. It never said it at all. So they added this, they tagged on this line right here in the second printing because prior to that, we just assumed that you were going to roll a die for damage and that it was going to be a 6er, and they literally never said that in the entire book. I think you're muted again, Paul, unfortunately. So while Paul fixes that vMix, our streaming software is giving us a couple troubles today, which is not great. So in the chat, some of us are thinking about other early sources like the Beyond This Point Be Dragons draft, which some people call the Daloon manuscript. which I think is a version of pre-publication D&D that someone made. And thanks for confirming as we fix the audio glitch at the moment.
Yeah, no, I can see the levels, Dan. Oh, you still can't hear me, can you?
You're back. You're back. Nope, you're back.
Oh, am I? Okay.
Yeah, you are.
That is fascinating. I don't know why it keeps dropping my audio. That's really weird. Okay. Okay. Sorry. I was going to ask Dan, when do we start seeing different numbers for damage?
Yeah, that's the first supplement, right? So for both damage and hits, and if we dig into the monsters again, it says you have hit dice of either 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Never says what die to roll. So for classes and monster hits and damage, it literally doesn't even say. It actually doesn't say until you get to the first supplement a year later. And then if you're asking for like damage rolls, this is the image that has the smallest text. It's one giant table and has teeny tiny little text in 3 columns. Perfect. So here you are in what's called the Greyhawk supplement a year later, and you have this addition at the top. It says the addition. This is like a new option. Damage done by weapon type, and it says if varying amounts of damage according to weapon type is employed, it says then you're also, in addition to this table, you're also going to have to look at this new table that gives variant damage for all the monsters. And so this is the first time where you have a list of weapon types in D&D with a particular damage type, and you can see that in this iteration you've got these two columns, one for man-sized opponents and one for larger than man-sized opponents. And so here you have a dagger doing what would be a 4-sided die, a hand axe does D6, a normal sword does D8, things like that. And basically, when that was established, that got used consistently through Advanced D&D First Edition, in BX, in Second Edition, in Third. These are basically the same damage amounts that exist today for weapons in 5th Edition even. The larger than man-sized option got snipped out. In BX, it got snipped out after 2nd Edition. But that first column is more or less the damage that has been consistent since then.
I'll point out, Dan, of course, that me coming from an era of BX, even in BX, this is still a thing, right? In BX, it's still the default damage is 1 to 6 for all attacks, unless you're using the variant damage by weapon type. I always remember finding that very annoying to deal with, because there's a whole separate chart in BX, right? There's here's the variable weapon damage, where you can look up how much damage each weapon does, which is totally separate from earlier tables of here are all the possible weapons and their weights and their costs. And I was like, why are these separated into 2 separate tables? It's annoying to have to jump back and forth in the book.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so we lived with that history for some time.
We did. You're right. There was a lot of organizational issues like that. I mean, here at least with BX, it was in one book, Paul. Technically, if you're playing original D&D, you're going to jump between multiple books where the hit tables are and these damage tables here in the supplement. So that things were... The organization of D&D books has certainly gotten better over time. And Hobo Ogre in the chat is reminding us that table in BX is clearly labeled optional. Here, originally we're looking at says addition. They couldn't even really use the right word for it. Optional's better, honestly.
In BX, it actually very specifically calls out amount of damage. All weapon attacks by character's PC or NPC will do 1 to 6, 1d6 points of damage adjusted by strength, if applicable. If the variable weapon damage system hereafter is used, check the weapon type. Right, so it's definitely very much d6 based. Yeah, which is fascinating. So I mean, the history aside, Dan, one of the I don't know if this is something you wanted to tackle here or not, but I think one of the things that, whether I don't know if you want to call this a good thing or a bad thing about D&D, but one of the things people say about it is that it kind of stretches your math skills, right? And it stretches your math skills usually by presenting you with options for different types of numeric variation, and you having to decide which is best. I feel like that's the most often this comes up. And I watched you go through this just the other day on Elder Times, right? You were looking at And I see it all the time, right? You're looking at a weapon, especially once you start dealing with multiple die types and bonuses after. You're like, okay, is a D6 plus 3 better or worse than 2D4 plus 1? Right? And then you sit there and you have to do a bunch of math and figure out.
And I think actually, I mean, again, I more or less had to look at this table right here. I think I was like fighting skeletons, and I had a two-handed sword plus 3 versus undead, but I could also just pick up a normal Morning Star, and the skeletons take half damage against edged weapons. So is a two-handed sword plus 3 halved better or worse than a normal Morning Star? And I had to do exactly that kind of calculation here.
Very interesting, I think. I feel like you become hyper aware of this in a game like actually Demon Wars, if anybody's ever played Demon Wars, where one of the benefits, like, it kind of presents two different types of bonuses to attacks or damages that you're going to make, either pluses at the end or increasing the die type. So your D4 becomes a D6, your D6 becomes a D8. And they have a whole chart in that of like how to progress it even higher, right? I think after D12 you start getting into like 2D6 or 2D8, right? And it starts right. It has this progression of like, what is another step? Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So they try to smooth that out with multiple dice, but then you still start wondering, is this good? I don't know. How does 1D12 compare to 2D6? Which would I rather be rolling?
when I'm running my my Wizards Warzone game that I have a couple times recently, sometimes I design, I can see how these things happen, because sometimes I design something on paper, or I do some math. I go, I would like there to be an environmental effect that does some damage each round, and I really want it to be 1 to 3. I want it to be 1, 2, or 3. And so you could say this is a D3. You could say I'm going to take a D6 and halve it. Even for me, the halving it with a D6, I have to remember, which way am I going to round that? Am I going to truncate it like a computer would? Am I going to round up so it's a uniform 1 to 3? And then when I get to the table, I go, it would be easier just to use a die type that physically exists, and I'm just going to turn into a D4 instead. So I found myself I'd kind of like this to be this kind of number, but then it's just physically easier at the table to just pick a die that's kind of close and say good enough.
Interesting.
So I feel that. Now, Laura Sudo in the chat had the question that to me is sort of the core of what I wanted to deal with today, actually. And so Laura Sudo was asking, and probably someone already told him, when did monster hit dice become D8s? And, Paul, you talking about BX, Laura Sudo said, I always thought that was a bit complicated in BX to need D8s for your hit dice. And the answer is this book that we're looking at right now. So this first supplement to D&D in 1975 that gave you the variant weapon damage we're looking at also gave you variant dice for the class hit dice, and also changed as a result the hit dice for monsters. And all of that happened here in this first supplement. So if you look at the there's an image file that has a big yellow highlight right at the bottom.
Okay.
And so the yellow highlight is the answer to Laura Sudo's question, to be perfectly clear. So in addition, a couple of pages after the weapon, or before the weapon variation, you also have this addition says statistics regarding classes is going to be modified this way. Whereas in original D&D, you were using D6s for fighters and magic users and clerics and everybody. Now, for the first time, you see this table. It says, hey, fighters are now going to use 8-sided dice. And it's just whatever your level is, that's how many 8-sided dice you've rolled for your hit points. And magic users are going to use D4s, and clerics will still use D6s. And here, thieves are going to use D4s, which is very, very weak. And they're new in this book, obviously. And then at the bottom, in the highlight, it says, now, use of this system is highly recommended, but if it is used, all monsters should now be based on the 8-sided die system. And the little parenthetical note is now, as a result, you have to change how Dragon Ages work, and you have to change how Kobold fractional hit dice work and things like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I personally feel that this is one of the top 6 mistakes in the evolution of D&D. I agree with Laura Sudo that if I have I don't know, like a fire giant, and I'm supposed to be rolling 11 dice for their hit points or 6 dice for a troll or something like that, it's a giant pain in the ass to grab my single D8 or start as a DM deciding to acquire lots and lots and lots of D8s for all of the hit points I'm going to have to roll. Whereas originally I could just grab my giant brick of D6s, which I already have, and that works perfectly fine. But declaring that the hit dice for monsters are D8s is a huge pain in the ass. And I think that was, it was sticky. That stuck around in D&D ever since. And I really have a big problem with that, honestly.
Well, Dan, I completely disagree.
Really? Holy crap!
Yeah. I don't. I'm super used to using D8s for monsters. Yeah. I understand the logic here, right? You want to keep monsters kind of on par with fighters, right? I'm assuming that's the logic. Is monsters are like fighters? Sure.
It doesn't say it, but that's my best guess too.
I mean, when I'm running a game, I dump out a bunch of dice behind my screen. The largest proportion of them are D8s, specifically for rolling monster hit dice. I have no problem with that. In fact, that's actually how I like to track monster hit points generally. Unless it's a very big monster who has a ton of hit dice, if it's like 2 or 3 per, I just grab little clusters of dice and roll them and let them sit behind my screen as the counter, and then I'll knock them down as they get hit. And I have a bunch of D8s for that. I don't know. I have a lot of dice. I'm not that worried. Are you telling me, Dan, that you still only have a couple of D8s? How many D8s do you own?
I think less than probably less than 8. 1, 2, 5, probably about 7. I think I probably have about 7 to 9, maybe, if I grab everything of different sizes and types and colors. Whereas, and call me OCD. I like having like a giant batch of all the same style of D6s. Makes me happy. I think there was a time where I did go out and say, I'm going to have to spend some time acquiring lots of D8s just for that purpose. Whereas I already have D6s for lots of stuff.
Yeah. And I would say, again, because of my method of tracking hit dice behind the screen, I actually like having a whole bunch of different colors so I can group them and be like, okay, the red ones are orc number 1 and the blue ones are orc number 2, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's an interesting take, and I really respect your lunatic opinion, Paul. I'm glad that you shared that, and I don't think you should feel too embarrassed about it.
I don't feel embarrassed about it at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm right.
I'm being really salty today.
Here's the thing, right? Like, it kind of comes to what's your background and how did you get here, right? Like, do I have a giant brick of D6s? No. Did I play a lot of war games? No, I did not. Right? I bought dice to play D&D with. That's why I bought dice. So I bought a lot of D8s. And I grew up with Moldvay, so I was used to D8 being the die that I use for hit dice. Always. It always has been. Yeah. As far as I'm concerned.
And for me too. It's what I grew up with. That's what it always was after 1975. So me having Holmes Basic to begin with, that's what it said. I played with BX, that's what it said. First edition AD&D, second edition, that's what it said. So that's also what I grew up with. And when I as someone that came to original D&D very late, like I didn't get my hands on it until 2007, and that was one of the things, having played with D8 hit dice for 30 years, it was a huge relief when I cracked open original D&D and went, oh, originally the hit dice were D6s. That would be so much easier. And to me, it was like a real sharp realization and a real relief that it could have been like that all along. I immediately just fell in love with that.
I want to jump back here to this list of recommended equipment. Okay, so if we say that the game has changed, such now the recommendation is to have 4 to 20 pairs of 8-sided dice. Mm-hmm. Let's see. So split that. Let's say you needed, 16 pairs of D8s. I bet if you poll our Wandering DM's viewing audience and said, how many of you right now, if you needed them, could pull out 16 pairs of D8s, actually have that many dice? I bet more than 50% of our viewers.
Yeah.
That's my...
16?
I would say the majority... the majority of gamers I know do not have a too few dice problem. They have the other problem of way too many dice.
I clearly don't have 16 8-sided dice myself. I clearly don't have that. And the funny thing is, as time goes on, at one point I thought that I had a lot of dice. I thought I was someone that had quite a few dice. And I think that, I think probably on average for the American population, I probably have above average. But maybe for standard D&D gamers, maybe I don't anymore, which is hard to wrap my head around.
That's another interesting poll. We got to put a poll out, Dan, because the other interesting question I want to ask is: do you think you own a lot of dice? Do you think you own too many or too few dice? Are you ashamed of the number of dice you own or not?
Okay, now normally I would want like hard quantifications. Do you have 5 or 10? But okay, now this makes me pretty happy actually.
Oh goodness.
Okay. The folks in the chat right now, there's nobody saying they have 16 8-siders at the moment.
I don't know.
Maybe it's a small sample size.
I mean, all right. Here's your. Now, Kevin says I buy dice by the pound. Same, Kevin.
Great, we found a new schism, right? We found a new D&D schism.
Oh my gosh, something that some irrelevant fact that gamers can disagree and argue over. That's what makes YouTube channels, my friend.
Should you buy dice by the pound, or should you individually select what you're going to have? Because I'm on that side. Individual selections of exactly the right size and angle and construction. You know what? Okay, look. Let's say you're in a universe where you need to buy lots of D8 specifically. I don't want to buy a pound of random stuff. I don't need a whole bunch of D4s. I don't need a whole bunch of D12s. Right? I just need D8s. And here's the problem, if I can point it out. Right? Mm-hmm. D8s aren't volume filling. Right? D6 you can stack them, right, in a convenient format like this, because cubes are volume filling and D8s are not. So you're going to have some cruddy ass jumbled up, right, bag of D8s that doesn't ship properly and is inefficient and bad for the environment. Yes, I said it.
Oh, goodness.
But Paul, I care about the environment. I don't know about you, but personally.
well then, we should all be using electronic random number generators, shouldn't we? Clearly the right way to go. Oh, goodness. Or we go back to chits. Is that? No, man, I guess that's paper. Oh, man, what is the most environmentally friendly method of randomly generating numbers?
It's all coin flips. It's all... Focus on. Okay, now I'm arguing with people in the chat.
Yeah.
Now, okay, so here's a little point there. Here's a little side point. Is arguably, it was easy for Gary Gygax to write, right? Again, write on the page. I've experienced this. He could write on the page. Yeah, use 8-sided dice for all the monster hit dice. It was very easy for him to write that down.
Mm-hmm.
Did Gary actually roll hit points? That's a little bit of an open question. I've asked that before, and it's a little bit unclear about whether Gary actually literally rolled stuff or whether he was just picking the hit points all the time. And I'll say, if you look at the monsters in his adventures, they don't statistically come out right. They practically always have above average hit points, and in fact, very frequently,
even for D8,
is like main. Say that again.
So they have above average hit points even if you assume D8s.
Yeah, wow. In many cases, yeah. So if you and one thing that he frequently does is he frequently sets like main monsters like 1 hit point under the maximum. I mean, they're really high. So if a gnoll right, has in advanced D&D is supposed to have 2d8 hit points, maximum 16. You'll usually see a null that specifically has 15 hit points. It's a
Wow.
thing that tends to happen. So yeah, it's like my guess is that he was probably picking stuff and kind of inflating stuff a little bit to be dramatic. And yeah, they tend to be. Like, if you look at the advanced D&D adventures, they tend to have hit points above the average, even for D8s.
Yeah. Interesting. So I mean, one interesting thing. I just want. Yeah. I mean, I want to go back to kind of one interesting thing I find about in this discussion is like, well, what is the easiest choice for humans to reason about, right? Like like you said with your, like, I want it to be 1 through 3, but like, gosh, if I just add a fourth one, then I can just say roll a d4, and that's just easier, right? And I always find that those choices really fascinating. And I wonder sometimes, like, okay, is adding the number of sides of the die, adding a sort of a third axis to the possibility space that makes it a three-dimensional problem, and that's really difficult because already you have the number of dice and the additional bonuses on top of that you're going to add, right? And that's a number. We as DMs play with that all the time. Okay, you can have a +1 here, you can have a -1 there, whatever, and those things. This seems easy when I roll that out, but then when like 6 of them collide, you're like, oh geez, okay, so we're at like 3d6 plus 7, right? Like, where am I now in the, like, I'd say already, and I guess that's the point that I'm coming to here, is that even if I remove one variable and say, okay, we're just gonna have all d6s, so we don't have to worry about the difference between a d8 and a d6 and a d4. It's still too much for my brain to wrap it around. It's still like the moment I get into multiple dice with multiple bonuses, I'm just like, I've lost.
Oh yeah.
What
Yes.
the probabilities
Agreed.
here are? What's the good choice?
And I've run into that, like I'm making stat blocks, and I don't know, maybe I'm joining, like in my book of Wargame, I have some figures that's a fighter riding on a griffin or a lich riding on a wyvern. And I'm trying to make some, it counts as one unit in the game. I'm trying to show a stat block for that. And I have this problem where the fighter dice are D8s and the griffin dice, I don't know, in original D&D, I still play with D6s. And now I've got a stat block that says the hit points are 9d8 plus 7d6 plus the constitution bonus from the fighter. And it actually doesn't fit in the space on the page anymore.
Yeah.
Right? So I've felt that. And in addition, right, in addition to like having a whole bunch of D6s issue, something that I just ran into is, again, here's like standard D6s, here's my normal D&D, D6, D8. So for the purposes of conventions, right, I got a couple really big jumbo-sized dice, right? And so I have just a couple, and they're a little pricier than normal, so I have just a couple really big D6s and D20s specifically, and I just needed this because I knew that in original D&D I can basically run the whole game. Yes, I still run with monsters with D6 hit dice because I find it convenient, and most of them are doing some kind of version of D6 damage. And one thing that I noticed in our book of Wargame 2 weeks ago is we started doing zoom in action. If we have a lord and a dragon that get in contact, we actually start playing original D&D. And I had to go grab my D8s for like sword damage, and it wasn't visible on camera. Right, just for my particular use case, my D8 was too small to actually be visible on camera, and presumably it would be too small at a table at a tournament with lots and lots of players. So I actually just went through my stat blocks, and I converted wherever there was a D8, I converted it back to, as people have suggested, D6 plus 1, specifically so my big D6 could be used for everything and would be visible on camera. So there's issues like that that I literally just ran into and had to convert D8 stuff back to D6 stuff for damage for convenience. So I've been running into that the last couple of weeks myself.
How come you didn't just buy an oversized D8?
Well, I didn't think about it in advance. I mean, for what it's worth, I didn't think about it in advance, and it's the only thing that I would need it for. I would only need it just for sword hits in that particular game. So, Probably
Honestly,
not going to do one more thing.
I mean, here's an interesting angle. One of the problems with assigning different die types to different weapon damages is that it skews the selection bias, right? Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But like, I feel like I've played a lot of D&D games where longsword is just the right choice, right? Why would you take a different weapon? It's for a one-handed weapon, it's the best damage. You should take a longsword, right? And maybe that's accurate. Maybe that's, historically, maybe there's a reason longsword was the weapon of choice because it is just better than a lot of these other weirdo weapons. But I do actually appreciate games, and I did this myself in Fearful Ends. In Fearful Ends, I just say, like, anything that is, like, longer than a foot that fits in your hand, it does this much damage. Consistently. Don't care. And it just opens the door for more flavor, I think. Of, like, I don't have to worry about, like, I think it would be clever for this guy instead to be holding a 2x4 with a bunch of nails in it, and then have to go, what is that like? How much damage should that do? No, it just does the one-handed, long-handled thing. Don't care. And I'll point out this is cribbed from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which again does generate, even though it does have a lot of actual specialty weapons, it does say like one-handed melee weapon is a one-handed melee weapon, and we're not going to care about the difference between a club or a sword or an axe, whatever. They're all the same.
I feel that, and if you take the the original D&D variant damage table, you snip out the large size stuff, and most of us, certainly I do that. I ignore the large size column. The weapon damage is close. It's not very different than what you just said. Actually, is like really, a really small thing like a dagger is a D4, and kind of like a simple thing like a hand axe is a D6. A nice, war weapon like a sword is a D8, and then something really big like a two-handed sword or a halberd is going to be a D10. And that's the only stuff that you see there initially. D&D does come from this wargaming background. It does have it. It is based on these tables in chainmail that have very specific parameters for the different martial types. And I got to admit, playing D&D, I don't mind having a little bit more detail about the specific differences of these medieval weapons. And I respect a game, personally, that simplifies it more than that. But I actually do like there being a reason to think about these 12 different things on the menu. And I actually don't like... I'm someone that actually doesn't like the players being able to reskin stuff at will. So the fact that the original D&D equipment table has 12 different melee weapons on it, I actually want a reason to distinguish one versus the other.
I could see
I know not
that.
everybody agrees.
I'm going to see if I can very quickly snip this out and put it on screen. It's probably not going to be fast enough. Let me just say, again, this is biased here because of my own experience coming from BX. One of the problems I have with it is I don't mind when there's like there's several options which you do need to grok and figure out which one do I want. There are right choices, unfortunately, I think, in the BX variable damage. If you look at BX variable damage chart, there are only 2 weapons that do a D8. And those 2 weapons are a battle axe and a sword. And the battle axe has a specific footnote that tells you it's two-handed. Right. And so if you're going to give up your ability to hold a shield and go for a two-handed weapon, well, why would you choose the low-damaging battle axe over a higher-damaging two-handed sword or polearm, which is going to give you D10? There's no good reason. Likewise, there's no good reason if you're going to take a one-handed weapon to take anything other than a sword, with the exception of you're a cleric and you're stuck. Mm-hmm. So basically, what you see is everyone carrying swords all the time. Yeah. And again, somebody I'm sure is going to want to argue that's accurate. Swords are a superior weapon. That's why everyone in the Middle Ages had them, because it was the best choice. Sure. Okay.
That's a solid argument, and I mean I can't disagree with how that shows up in Moldvay. You're right, and my players were always carrying swords around. It becomes the default, right? Whereas it was all d6s to begin with. Now the default hit dice for all the monsters is d8s, and the default damage of all the players is the d8s because they're all carrying swords. So now the whole game is all d8s, and I think that's a glitch, personally. Partly, Moldvay's making some really good choices about simplifying that, twice as complicated table originally. And then as a result, the simplification has, boxed you into this situation. So I do think for my games, just a little bit more detail to the elements of the weapons solves that problem. And so in my OED Original Edition Delta rules, and it's available for free at oedgames.com, you can go see what I feel like I solved that problem in about 3 lines of text by giving a little bit more interesting something to the different weapon types. And it works very well for me, and I don't have that problem in my games of everybody carrying a sword. It's a good weapon, but just for starters, some people want to carry spears, because then you can attack from a back rank. And, Gary supports that in a strategic review article at some point. And so, just give a little bit of flavor to something, make the maces hit through heavy armor a little bit better. And I think you're very, very close to solving that problem. As shown in BX, I don't disagree.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. So, definitely we're getting heavily into preference area here, I'm sure.
Sure.
Generally, yeah, it's interesting because it's sort of both like what level of detail do you want? I certainly, I guess, like, how do you feel, Dan, about playing, say, Pool of Radiance and having to have your characters carry around multiple weapon options? Or, well, we might fight undead and I might need a Morningstar, and we might fight big monsters, in which case I want two-handed swords, etc. Do you enjoy that?
I think it's an interesting decision. I'm happy to engage with that problem and have an interesting decision. And what weapon do I carry versus the encumbrance issue? This is stuff that I do actually like in original D&D. I do like managing the encumbrance as a resource, and I have. And making a good decision about that makes me feel happy, honestly. I actually do like that being in D&D. I really do. And I like being able to dig into a text about medieval weapons, about why one would use a spear versus a sword, and have that feed into my D&D game about exactly what the nuances are. I think that's part of what, for me, classic D&D brings to the table.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's definitely. Yep. Okay. It's not for me. I think not what I enjoy about the game. I would rather. I'm more interested in like how the weapon type presents, what visual it has, what it says about the character. Right? Are you the type who has a nice, shiny, fancy one-handed longsword, or are you carrying a hunk of wood with a couple of nails shoved through it? It's interesting to me. And I don't want to have to do a bunch, and I get annoyed, frankly, if I'm like, I got to juggle all these pieces of equipment just so that I can game the system and sort of get one extra point of damage here or there. Generally, I don't, frankly. Like when I'm watching you play Elder Times, you're definitely doing a level of analysis that is deeper than I've ever done. Where I'm like, I see this character as a two-handed wielder. I like that it matches their icon. I'm just going to give him this sword. Okay. It's cool. And not really care that it's not the most efficient weapon for him to be using.
That's a good, alternate viewpoint for me to hear, because admittedly, that's not the fluid that's normally running around my brain. So it's really good for me to hear that other people play in other ways. And now I will also point out that me running the public stream, right? I have to try to act like I'm proficient, because some folks want to see proficient play, and will have correct opinions pointing out if I'm not doing something totally optimal. So I might have a little bit more incentive
to try to optimize that stuff than when you're normally playing Pool Radiance the way that it was normally intended to be.
And I wanna bring up. Sorry. Oh,
and in fact,
goodness.
You can look at the chat right now where people are pointing out some things that I could have done better right this second, Paul. So there's that.
Fantastic. I know we're pretty much out of time here, but I just wanted to share this just because I finally managed to snip this table. I know it's the text on the bottom; it's a little cut off. I managed to snip this table so we could look at it together. But the fascinating thing about this table to me right now is just a piece that I think I've never really grokked, which is this sub note at the bottom that says when you have a two-handed weapon, it's obviously pointing out, oh, you can't use a shield, that might reduce your armor class. Okay, and also you will always lose initiative. Did you know you always lose initiative when you have a two-handed weapon? I've never internalized that rule before, and I'm like now looking at that as if this is a brand new rule that I'm just being told for the first time ever. Really, you lose initiative for having a two-handed weapon? I had no idea.
I think that's broadly unique to Moldvay's BX there, and I will point out that implies that you've got to use individual initiative, which itself is optional in those rules.
That is interesting. Yeah. I can see that. And then the other piece of information that I feel like is always missing from these is you have small race types like dwarves and halflings who are not allowed to use large weapons, and then now my brain is broken because I have to decide for myself what's a large weapon. What counts? Yeah. Right? Can a halfling wield a battle axe two-handed? I don't know.
Yep, I agree. And I will say, I think it's a mistake to make the battle axe two-handed here. If anything at all, right? I think if anything at all would improve this table and improve your point is just remove the asterisk next to battle axe.
Interesting.
And then at least you've got two options for the D8 one-handed type, and that would give it some additional texture. I think, to my eye, that's the single biggest mistake in this table. It's just that one asterisk.
Interestingly, your counterpoint, halfling restrictions says they can use any type of weapon and armor which has been cut down to their size, thus they cannot use a two-handed sword or a longbow, but may use a sword or short bow. So one might argue that the battle axe is the only option for a halfling to use as a two-handed weapon. Maybe.
Does it say anything about polearms?
It doesn't say anything about polearms, and now that's really weird. I don't know.
Right?
Can a halfling use a polearm but not a two-handed sword? I'm really confused. Right. Okay, we are so out of time.
I agree.
So viewers, if you have opinions on we were talking about dice types or variable damage per weapon.
Do you like the game being like basically D6 hit dice and damage, or do you like the game being basically D8 hit dice and damage after that first supplement?
Yep. Are you annoyed by the need to have a large quantity of D8s, or is that just every day for you because you live in a mountain of dice? Leave us a comment. Drop us a note here in the chat or the discussion, the comment section of the YouTube video. Tell us what you think. We'll check that out, and maybe that will expand the discussion. Maybe we'll have another follow-up video in the future based on your thoughts.
As a final note, Paul, let me just get a final opinion. What do you prefer for monster hit dice, D6s or D8s in your classic D&D?
D8s.
The answer is
I thought
D6s.
I answered that already. D8s.
The answer is D6s. No, D6s, sir. Yeah. I respectfully disagree.
The only use for D6 is if you're using an inefficient weapon, which you should get rid of and go get yourself a longsword.
Nice.
There you go.
Nice. Awesome. Anyway, on that note, remember, if you're new to the channel, you can like and follow and subscribe to us and get more conversations like this. And we have a presence on YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook and GitHub and TikTok. And we do have the handle Wandering DMs on all those sites. So look for us there and you'll get notifications on updates on upcoming shows.
If you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can do that. Those podcasts are available on our website at wanderingdms.com. You can also find our podcasts on various carriers like iTunes and Spotify and Google Podcasts. if you're listening to this show right now on one of those sites and you have a moment, please leave us a rating or review or whatever that site allows for. That helps other users of that site find our show, and we really appreciate it.
We really do. And again, like Paul said at the top of the show, big thanks to our patrons who support the show here. If you'd like to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms, and you'll see the different tier options. Every single tier option gets you access to our Discord server where the conversation continues. We had, this show itself was partly inspired by questions about, are you using D6s or D8s for the hit dice on your monsters these days? And why or why not? So, get in there and you'll be engaged, and we'll probably get some more ideas for future shows like that. And we'll be there to continue the conversation here in the video after chat. I had other ideas that didn't fit into this hour, Paul. So maybe I'll get to share those in private in the Discord video chat in about 10 minutes or so, and get your opinion to see whether you think it's crazy or not.
Excellent. Come join. If you want to get in on that, hear Dan's extended thoughts that he failed to get to. I mean, there were definitely several more images of tiny text I can't read to share. So, yeah, come join our Patreon. Maybe Dan will show you some pictures of text.
And that's Wandering Amps. I'll be back Thursday night at 8:30 p.m. for more of the AD&D Pool Radiance play, and so feel free to jump in and give your opinion about whether I'm optimizing things properly or not as I walk through the end game back in the graveyard area, hopefully. So we'll look forward to that on Thursday, and of course we'll be back next Sunday because we're live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So please join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.